Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the video recording for our CEC presentation. My name is Brandi Simonsen and I am joined today by my colleagues and friends, Susan Barrett, Jen Freeman, and Steve Goodman. And we're going to spend the next little while with you talking about how to integrate academic, social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health support within an MTSS framework, a multi-tiered systems of support framework. And the four of us are here today representing in part our roles on the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. And we also have relationships and connections with the National Multi-Tiered System of Support Research Network focused on integrated multi-tiered systems of support, and some connections with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So we just want to give credit to all of those organizations that have so informed the messages that we will share with you all. So we're going to chunk this video into four main content areas. So first, we're going to start with a focus on why think about integrating academic and behavior support within an MTSS framework. So why do the I part of IMTSS? And then I'm going to pass it over to Susan, who's going to talk a little bit more about why and really emphasize the importance of also integrating mental health within our framework. Jen's going to then pick up and talk about how we specifically support students with the practices that we implement. Steve's going to take back over and talk a little bit more about how we support educators within the framework. And then Susan will come back at the end to share some kind of concluding thoughts, follow-up conversations, and ways for you all to be able to take this video and help it influence the work you're doing back in your schools, districts, and states. So with that, we're going to start the conversation about what is an integrated multi-tiered systems of support, or IMTSS framework. And I think for many of us, MTSS is a familiar concept. We automatically have the triangle come forward in our minds as one of those central images. But I wanted to start us with thinking about how we really center the work in our important guiding principles, or some of us may say our values or core features. And so for us, all of this work starts with really centering equity. So thinking about what it means to implement MTSS with equity centered means that we're holding that priority and the idea that we are going to provide supports for each and every student, each and every staff, and each and every family member within the framework. So thinking about all students, but truly all meaning all. So thinking about different racial and ethnic groups, thinking about ability groups, gender, sexuality, any of the demographic characteristics, really thinking about what it means for all to mean all. And for us, MTSS is a pathway to achieve that equity. So if we're truly implementing an MTSS framework, we're thinking about those universal or tier 1 interventions and supports that we can put in place as a foundation of support for all. We're thinking about then using data to identify students, staff, and families who might need additional support, and layering on those targeted supports to set those folks up for success. And then identifying individuals, whether they're students, staff, or families who have more intensive or individualized needs, and layering on even more intensive supports so that all members of our community have a chance to experience benefit and success. So if we keep equity centered in the work that we're doing, it helps us really think about how we then have to create that robust foundation and then further differentiate supports, and then use our data to help hold ourselves accountable to actually achieving equitable outcomes. So as we're thinking about outcomes, then we're really talking about having student growth and benefit be the filter for all of the decisions that we make. So as we're thinking about whether it's bringing a practice in or leveraging a different systems feature, we're really holding ourselves accountable to the decision that we make, drawing the fastest and shortest line to see kid benefit. And of course, while we're talking about kid benefit, we're also going to incorporate staff and families into those areas of benefit. So when we think about how we help support our students, staff, and families, one of the first places we often go to is thinking about the practices that we're going to put in place. And because we can't do all the things, we're going to have ourselves really think about a small number of evidence-based or empirically supported practices, those practices that research tells us are likely to be effective. And we're going to think about how we can take those small numbers of practices and make sure that they are culturally and contextually relevant for our learners. So thinking specifically about who is in our community, their age, their needs, their kind of diverse backgrounds, and how we can bring them into the practices and the practices to really fit and center in the community that we serve. To be able to do that well and to actually be able to focus on a few things, The whole focus of today's conversation is around integration, right? How can we connect those practices so that we're not choosing practices only to serve academics or only to focus on social, emotional, behavioral skills, but instead how we can really bring those together so a small number of practices can actually have a huge benefit across all areas of need for students. And to hold ourselves accountable, again, to how we're going to set students up for success and make sure that we know that they got there, we're going to use data to guide our decisions. And thinking about data informing decisions about screening, so who needs what, progress monitoring, how it's going across time, holding ourselves accountable to equitable outcomes for all, including the different subgroups and individual students, and really monitoring how we're implementing and supporting fidelity. And to make all of this possible, we're going to invest in systems. So thinking about those structures that we have in place that support staff, that set us up for success, and that allow us to implement and sustain our implementation across time. So systems set us up to be able to better support students while also supporting staff. So these guiding principles underlie all of the work that we're doing within an integrated MTSS framework. So beyond guiding principles, we're going to think a little bit about what that framework looks like. And the National Research Network on Integrated MTSS has defined IMTSS in terms of a series of core features. And you'll notice that these map on to the graphic we just saw. So first, we think about integrated MTSS having a continuum of research-informed, evidence-based practices that really do pull together academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs of students and have a small number of practices meet those needs. And as we mentioned with the continuum, it's that idea of having a robust foundation and differentiating to meet the needs of all. As we just talked about, the idea is to use data to drive decisions, but really thinking about an integrated way of looking at data. So not separately examining academic, attendance, behavior, community-based data, but instead pulling that together. So as a school team, we're looking at all the different data points that help us understand student need and student strength. We're going to integrate our teaming and coaching structure. So at that systems level, we're thinking about how to pull areas of expertise into one team so we can make more comprehensive decisions about support. And we're not going to leave it to teachers to figure out how to pull the practices together. We're going to actually provide integrated professional development so that as I'm learning how to implement the new math curriculum, I'm also learning about how to integrate social, emotional, and behavioral supports within that curriculum. And we're going to consider additional systems that Steve's going to talk about in a little bit, thinking about policy and practice and how those all come together. So I wanted to land us a little bit on a start of the why. So as we think about all of those pieces of integration coming together, it's not that we're integrating for the sake of integrating, right? It's not just that we're trying to create a more perfect picture. We're intentionally integrating where it results in student benefit. And one of the things that we've learned from decades of research is that academic and social, emotional, and behavioral needs, academic and social, emotional, and behavioral support go hand in hand. So when we can integrate implementation, we can actually see improved performance. And another piece that we've started to think about and learn is that those relationships between academic and social and emotional behavioral support are important, right? Good, effective instruction sets us up to be a protective factor for a lot of the concerns or risks around social, emotional, and behavioral needs. Likewise, if we can provide effective social, emotional, and behavioral support, we can have students that are ready to learn and are reinforced by learning. So when we think about that integration, we think about how to create an effective context for learning. We think about how to select appropriate culturally relevant content. We think about how to use data to drive our academic and social, emotional, and behavioral instruction. And we think about how we can then support educators to implement in an integrated way. And one of the reasons we know this is so important, as we just said, is while at the kid level, those needs and those practices are integrated, at the systems level, we see big benefits in implementation of these supports within a framework. So in this quick graphic, we're going to do a quick tour of outcomes. So starting with implementation of PBIS, next we'll think about the outcomes related to implementation of response to intervention frameworks, which primarily focus on academics. And then we're going to land with what we know about implementation of integrated MTSS with fidelity. So initial research is showing us that when we implement PBIS with fidelity, we achieve meaningful SEB outcomes, so meaningful improvements in social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And we also see decreases in use of reactive management, so things like office referrals, suspensions, expulsions. So we at this point have decades of research that is showing us when we implement PBIS well, we turn the dial on really important outcomes for kids in the social, emotional, and behavioral domains. As you're looking toward the right side, you'll notice that the research is a little bit mixed for academics. In some of the studies, we're seeing really robust impact for whether it's reading or math scores, but those are not always consistent across different studies. And so we need to do a little bit more research to understand and unpack the academic outcomes when we implement PBIS alone. In the next row, there's been some preliminary research to support the concepts behind response to intervention. In particular, in the area of early literacy, there's some nice promising research around implementing evidence-based literacy practices within an RTI framework. There's less known about the impacts of that kind of academic framework on social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. But if you peek at those two rows, you can kind of see how the two elements come together to set students up for success. So very preliminary research suggests that when we actually integrate both academic and SEB supports within an MTSS framework, we see robust outcomes for both. So these studies have been started by multiple research groups. The National Research Network on IMTSS is picking up some of that research and going to continue to inform. But we're really excited about the promise of an integrated framework to be able to support students across all areas of need and all disciplines. So with that, we're going to encourage you all to think back in your schools, districts, and states about how to really emphasize and leverage the power of academic and social, emotional, and behavioral supports within an integrated MTSS framework. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Susan, and my friend, Susan, who's going to talk a little bit more about the why and have us really think about how to integrate school-based mental health within an MTSS framework.
Thanks, Brandi. So we're going to start to talk about an integrated model, but now we're going to start to talk about pulling in the school mental health system. And we know that right now there is so much emotional need and mental health need for our students and our staff. And this didn't necessarily start with the pandemic, for sure, because we had a mental health crisis before the pandemic, but we haven't done a really good job of situating comprehensive school mental health into the MTSS framework in a very intentional way. And I want to start to talk about the why we need to do that by elevating a quote by the Secretary of Ed, Secretary Cardona. I love this quote. He put this out in a tweet back in March, but it really kind of speaks to how we redesign school forever using a multi-tiered system of support and intentionally integrating it. And he says this: in the past, student access to structured mental health services in schools hasn't been implemented in a functional way. It's been ancillary and after the fact, and now we have this opportunity to redesign schools and make sure that mental health services are a core part of the school's DNA. And again, we've learned so much by integrating social, emotional, behavior supports and academic. And now it's really time to intentionally ensure that school mental health services is a part of that equation. So we're going to continue to lean in on the implementation framework. And we want to offer this definition because it's going to help as we pull in our community partners. It's going to help kind of have everyone rally around this common way of work, right? Where together we expand our teams to make sure we're including our families and our youth and our community partners. And we're going to help each other organize all of the resources we not only have within our school, but in our surrounding neighborhood and community. We are going to make sure that we are actively uncovering what students' strengths and what students' needs are, because we want to make sure that kids get help early. We want to continuously invest in the stuff that's likely to work, right? What are those evidence-based practices that are customized to match our school community's strengths and our needs? We're going to make sure that we push in to ensure that our staff have adequate supports to do what we're asking them to do with fidelity. And I want to make the point here, I think we need to be transparent that we're asking staff, everybody, educators, clinical providers, and leaders to do things a little bit differently moving forward. And we haven't always designed our training, our pre-service training, to kind of meet that, what we're asking them to do. So it's going to be really important that we empower everybody to come to the table and be honest and transparent about what the needs are, because we really have to make sure that the coaching and training supports are continuously there. And we'll know that by relying on that data that will be fuel to ignite where we need to amplify specific training elements, specifically around mental health, because there's so many of us see mental health as not being part of our job. And so it's going to be really important that we lean in and listen to the conversations from our staff, that we're unpacking what mental health is, and we are situating it in the context of the academic dimensions of mental health and wellness. So that's going to require a lot of work, a lot of redesign, but we're going to anchor all of that redesign in the implementation framework. We also need to focus on staff, on the educators when we're redesigning this whole system kind of response. So we're going to invest in a culture of wellness. And again, we're going to rely on that public health approach, that tiered aspect of this, and we're going to make sure that the vast majority of social, emotional, and behavioral needs are met before we kick it up a notch. So we're going to continuously lean into the public health approach. We're going to give equal priority for teaching social, emotional, and behavior skills right alongside academic achievement. So it's this all hands on deck approach where we're not just relying on a small group of staff that push in and teach those skills. We want to teach it right as we're teaching our academic skills. And we're going to bring our community partners in to do this work, and not in a co-located way. We're going to have them as fully embedded members of our school community. And we're going to do this because we know that most of our kids actually receive supports inside schools. And we also know that youth are 6 times more likely to complete the evidence-based treatment when offered in schools than in other community settings. So it's important to consider that we're pushing it into the schools to be that kind of primary care provider, if you will, in the mental health space. And we're going to rely on more people around the table to do this. It's not just kind of on the shoulders of the school to figure this out. We want to highlight a couple of resources that have just been released at the federal level. One that came out from the department, the United States Department of Education, and then one that came out from the Surgeon General. And we've got links that we're providing to both of those documents, and we want to offer this, that even though they come from separate departments, the common messages are there. We also want to highlight the fact that in the guidance that the Department of Ed put out, there's so many implementation examples of schools in real time redesigning their system and intentionally integrating and aligning their efforts to a single system of support. And so we hope that you'll take some time to go through the recommendations, but also to kind of lean in and learn from the implementation examples from across the country. The bottom line and key takeaway is this. there is a full continuum of mental health supports. And one of the biggest things we can do as educators in this space is to make sure that we are creating successful school climates, positive, nurturing, caring environments, environments that are consistently positive, predictable, safe, and effective. And that across the cascade of implementation, we're taking that upstream view, we're taking that promotion and prevention aspect in all of this to make sure that first and foremost, the vast majority of social, emotional, behavioral needs are met, not only for our students, but for the adults working with our students. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to go into a little bit more specifics around how we support students in this integrated model.
All right, in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about how we do this. So if you've been listening to Brandi and Susan talk about the idea of an integrated framework and why we should do it and how important it is for students' social, emotional, behavioral outcomes, their academic outcomes, their mental health outcomes, you may be sitting there wondering, what does this look like? I'm sold, but I need to know how to do this. So I'm going to give you a couple of resources, and we're going to talk a little bit about the specific practices that we would use to support students if we were implementing this integrated multi-tiered system of support. So the first big message here is that less is more, and that we want to make sure that we are boiling down the practices in each of these different domains to these basic critical buckets of practice. And that regardless of whether we're talking about academic supports, social, emotional, behavioral supports, mental health supports, we're going to think about specific practices in each of these buckets. So, and this work came about from a collaboration across a number of different national centers focused on literacy, focused on social, emotional, behavioral support, focused on implementation. And it was really the work of that collective that came up with this really integrated approach to thinking about these practices. And so it starts with the idea that we need to connect. We need to connect with students. And we can connect to build relationships. We can connect to enhance communication. But it starts with that basic connection. So a positive greeting at the door, a quick email, a quick message to students, a way to reach out and establish that relationship and build communication with students. And that's where it starts, regardless of kind of whether you're looking at academics, whether you're looking at mental health, or whether you're looking at social, emotional, behavioral supports. Once we've kind of built those initial connections, we also need to think about how to screen and thinking about how do we screen to identify students' social, emotional, behavioral needs, their academic needs, their mental health needs, using a combination of data sources. So formal screeners, informal screeners, in a team-based approach will help us think about from a variety of different data sources, what the needs are. How do we recognize what students' strengths are? How do we recognize what their needs are so that we can build a multi-tiered system of support that really meets their needs? We then need to think about supporting students by establishing a safe, predictable, positive environment. And this really comes down to the idea that we need to think about how do we establish routines within the environment so the students know what to expect when they come in. They know what they should be doing, how they should interact with each other and with the environment around them. And we need to explicitly teach both the sort of academic enabling skills and their social, emotional, behavioral skills that they need to be successful in that environment. And so we're going to specifically teach the expectations and specific skills that they need. And along with that, we're going to make sure that we have lots of practice opportunities, and so that it really just becomes the way we do business in a building, that those routines and habits are formed and students know what to expect when they walk in. The next bucket is thinking about how do we teach. We're going to teach both academic and social, emotional, behavioral skills, of course. And we're going to think about how do we do that explicitly. So we're not going to leave it to chance that we assume students know these skills. We're going to make sure we're explicitly teaching all of the skills that students need, both to master the reading curriculum, but also to be able to access that learning, to be able to monitor their own engagement, to be able to think about their own learning and their own interactions in the classroom. And we're going to do that by explicitly teaching and by providing effective feedback. So both telling students what they've done well and providing effective instructional corrective feedback in a ratio that allows for students to hear more positive than negative. So we're going to shoot for a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio of positive feedback over corrective feedback for students in that teaching bucket, again, regardless of the content here. So, and then finally, the last bucket is really thinking about how do we monitor both implementation. So are the adults doing what we said we we're going to do? Are we connecting, screening, supporting, teaching the way we plan to? And the outcomes from that. So thinking about monitoring student safety, thinking about their health, their social, emotional, behavioral outcomes, their academic outcomes, and using that data then to monitor the effectiveness of our system and let us know when we need to intensify or adjust our framework. And so as we think about intensifying, we also are going to need to plan ahead to differentiate those basic practices for students who may need more. And so that first round through is your tier 1, thinking about what do we do for everybody. And we know that some students are going to need more. And so when we think about how do we differentiate those basic practices, it's really using the data that we gleaned from that tier 1 practice and using it to target each of these buckets more specifically towards student strengths and needs. So we're amplifying their strengths and meeting their needs as best as possible. And you can learn a lot more about the specific practices with links to resources for how to implement those in these 2 guides. The first is sort of an overall guide called Returning to School During and After Crisis. There are sections of that are designed for state level implementation, district level implementation, and school level implementation. So you can grab the section that makes most sense for you. And then the second guide really talks about how to do this for kids with more intensive needs. So what does it look like to really differentiate these supports, and how would I use data to guide that? And so those 2 guides are really excellent resources for figuring out what these practices look like when we do an integrated system of support. Now, of course, this is not a packaged curriculum. So just because I named a couple of those practices does not mean that you should run out and do all of them right now. The idea here is to use a data-based framework to think about how do we select and implement those different practices. And so it starts with a team. It starts by pulling together that representative team, and it starts with gathering information. And it starts by looking at strengths and needs across these different domains. So what are students' academic and cognitive strengths and needs? What are their social, emotional, behavioral needs? And what are their health and wellness needs? And it's intentionally focused on both strengths and needs here, and that we're not going to just kind of dig out. A lot of teams kind of dive right into, oh no, we have a problem with reading in 2nd grade. What are the strengths in 2nd grade? Because that will allow you to help build a more effective framework as well. So the gathering information stage starts with identifying strengths and needs, kind of on that more quantitative data side, but it also should go into this, the idea of thinking about context and culture. And so thinking about what are the learning histories of the students and staff in your building, and how might that impact implementation? What are the values and norms in your community and in your school? Are they the same for staff and students, and how do they vary across your community? And what do you know about the home and school context for your students and your staff? And use that information to also inform the development of your multi-tiered system of support. You're then going to use that data process and use that to kind of identify specific areas of need and specific areas of strength that you can build upon. And that will help inform which practices you select. And so when you're thinking about selecting specific practices, there are a couple of things to consider. And one really important one is match to student strengths and needs. We see a lot of school districts and schools go out and say, there's a new practice out there and it sounds excellent, we should do it. There's even evidence behind it, we should do it. The first filter for your team really needs to be, does it match a need in our building? Does it amplify its strength? Does it meet a need? And if it doesn't do that, then don't waste your time implementing it. You don't need it. But if it does match a student need, think about to what extent can it be, or is it already adapted to fit the culture and context of your particular school? And think about where it fits in your overall continuum. So is it a practice that's needed for all students and staff in your building? Is it a practice that's needed for some students who just need some additional targeted support? Or is it something that's needed for a few kids that are really individualized? And so think about where it fits within your overall continuum. Once you've identified a couple of key practices that meet those requirements, you're going to think about what are the implementation supports that are needed to do that well in your building. So it's not enough to just say, we're going to do this, we're all excited. We need to be really intentional about thinking about how we can ensure that it's done well, because we're not going to waste our time doing things without really going all the way. And so when we think about implementation supports, there are a couple of things to consider. Think about environmental support. How do we set staff and educators in the building up for support? What are things we can do to remind them of what it is that we're going to do to make it easier for them to do this? Some of this is taking things off their plate. Sometimes it's providing prompts or reminders in the environment for what it is that they're supposed to be implementing. We need to make sure we're spending time on skill development so that we're teaching educators and staff and our implementers exactly what it is that they need to be able to do so that they can do it well and they can do it really fluently. So it doesn't feel like it's extra work on top of everything else. It just comes naturally. And then we need to do all of that through a lens of function-based support so that we're really thinking about how does this implementation, how does my implementation of this practice impact students' needs and make sure that we're not reinforcing behaviors that we don't want to reinforce and that we're strengthening behaviors that we do. And so using that function-based lens to help guide our implementation is really, really important as well. And so when we think about implementing an integrated multi-tiered system of support, there's no standard curriculum, there's no standard package. There are those key buckets to think about in terms of how do we connect, screen, support, teach, and monitor. But then you use this data-based framework to really make sure that you're selecting the practices that meet the need, whether that be academic need, mental health need, or social emotional behavioral need in your building, and build the implementation supports to ensure that it's effective. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk a little bit about how we really support staff to be able to do this well.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to talk about how do we support educators while implementing an integrated multi-tier system support. We do this by focusing on systems. Now, across the system, we talk about different levels of the implementation cascade. And this, certainly we want meaningful outcomes for our students, but the students are supported through effective practices by educators. Educators in the classroom are supported by leadership teams at the school level. The school is also supported by the district, and the district supported by state. So we see different levels of the cascade. And what we are trying to do is create a culture of wellness and competence at each of these levels of the cascade so that we can get the results we want. Now, we do know that at the state, district, and school levels, we need to make sure that we have effective teams to provide ongoing professional development, coaching, technical assistance, and also monitoring of implementation of key practices, so that we can actually make sure we're on the right track and getting the results that we want. Now, when we look at this graphic here, a leadership team is really important, as we mentioned, at each of the levels, at the school level, at the district, at the state level. That leadership team should have some connection over the influence over the budget, policy, and practice, so that resources can be allocated to make sure effective practices are implemented well. That leadership team would take information from stakeholder engagement, look at funding and align that with other key practices, policies, and look at the workforce capacity. That leadership team then turns that information and resources into effective training, effective coaching, and evaluation, so that we can see an integrated model implemented well. Now, at the district level, we look at key drivers, and a driver is the first one, looking at leadership and management. At the district level, leadership and management should provide a vision, should provide guidance on what to do, why we should be doing it, and assistance to get it done. The district supports should also provide professional development or access to professional development, so that educators can know how they should be implementing these practices in an integrated fashion. And finally, the district should provide effective work environments and to make it easy to do it right. That would be things like making sure that there are resources, materials available, time to do it. And what we know is if it's done in this way, knowing what to do, why do it, and systems to get it done, moving into how to do it, and then make it easy to do it right, that sequence tends to be an effective order for implementing with fidelity. Now, I'm going to turn it back to Susan, who's going to share some final thoughts with you.
Thanks, Steve. So at this point, you've heard a lot of information, and we wanted to offer a couple of final thoughts. Bottom line is this: there are a lot of acronyms flying around, right? We've got MTSS, PBIS, RTI, IMTSS. We don't care what you call it necessarily, but what we do care is that you are focused on the core features. So we want to make sure that we're working together in a team, right? This is a team sport. We also want to make sure that we've got our community health providers embedded in those teams across the tiers. So we've got content experts in academic, we've got content experts in social, emotional, and behavioral health, and we've got content experts in mental health. And together we understand the systems that are needed to organize the adults. So effective teams is going to be that through line in all of the work that we're doing. And we're going to intentionally design this together moving forward. The other thing you heard throughout all of this presentation is how important data is. And we want to move beyond those natural data sources that we have been using within our schools and really pull in that community lens, that expanded context. And we do that when we bring family and youth partners and community partners in to look at trends and patterns that are emerging in the neighborhoods and communities that the schools are situated in, so that we can get kind of a head start on what's going on in the community. Because chances are, if it's happening in the community, it's not, it's probably going to happen if it's not already happening in the schools. And that helps us kind of stay in that upstream viewpoint. It also helps us elevate the strengths and the resources that are in our community so that we can pull those in because the needs are so great, and no one entity is going to be able to do this alone. We also need a formal process for selecting and implementing a small number of evidence-based practices, right? That was a theme that we heard throughout this presentation. We also have heard that early access through comprehensive screening for both internalizing and externalizing needs is also an important consideration. Again, this actively uncovering before kids have an opportunity to fail in the system is going to be a key element of the work moving forward. And then the final last two core features, right? This notion that we need to rigorously progress monitor both for effectiveness and fidelity of all the interventions, regardless of who delivers, right? We want to invest in a common way of work, no matter if it's an academic skill that needs increased support or a mental health skill. At the end of the day, we're using and designing an instructional approach for wellness and academics and social emotional. And we're going to invest in that progress monitoring strategy across all of those content areas. And then finally, the important consideration around training and coaching, both at the systems level. So we're all investing in a systems approach, no matter what content expert we're bringing to the table. We're all approaching this in a systems kind of thinking way and really anchoring the work in implementation science and the drivers that implementation science offers us. So again, think fidelity, think that whatever we do, that the intent is focused on student benefit and student outcomes. We're just not counting the number of kids who are getting services in the mental health space, right? We want to move beyond that. Our kids deserve better. So we're going to adopt that rigorous progress monitoring for fidelity and implementation at the systems level, at the practice selection level, and at the implementation fidelity level. So here are some key takeaways. Stay upstream. We realize and recognize how challenging that can be right now, given the magnitude of need in our school communities. But we're going to need to make sure that while we're addressing those needs, we are staying upstream and we're taking time to disrupt the status quo, because what we were doing before the pandemic wasn't working for so many of our kids, so many of our families, and so many of our staff. So it's important that we stay upstream and we lean in and we listen to our community, including our youth, including our families. Do less. Streamline what you're doing. Streamline that in maybe consolidating your teams, consolidating the number of evidence-based practices or innovations you're trying to take on. Really decide as a team, what can we put on the back burner right now? And what do we need to elevate to make sure that we are meeting the vast majority of social, emotional, behavior need of everybody in our system? Focus on collective care of our staff. We've got to move beyond the conversations around self-care. And while there is a lot that we need to do and an own responsibility for our own self-care, this is really about using the MTSS logic to create a culture of care and collective care for the staff. Again, elevate the youth voice, family voice, and community voice, and empower them to engage and co-design this effort together. And again, recognizing that this is a daunting task, right? This feels like it's so much right now. Could we lean into using a phase-based approach, right? This chunking of the work that we need to do, making decisions as a team about what we put forward and what we put on the back burner. And maybe we chunk it in terms of thinking about the phases of crisis recovery. And in this, this time right now, where a lot is happening in real time in our communities, it could take a little bit longer than we first had anticipated. But what the crisis recovery researchers tell us that that the most common outcome in crisis recovery is resilience. And if we can keep our eye on that positive piece, I think it will really help us stay focused on what we need to do now, and not get kind of bogged down in kind of all the need that's kind of out there. So with that, hopefully you enjoyed the session. We recognize that this is a lot. So if you, we tried to chunk it in different sections. So if you like an aspect of what you heard today, it could be that you take this back to your team, maybe do a little watch party, maybe you just do a watch party on a segment of this presentation, and then you action plan with your team after you do that watch party. So thank you for your time. It was an honor to be with you all today, my colleagues especially. So give a huge shout out to Steve Goodman, Jennifer Freeman, and Brandi Simonsen. And we will see you next time.